Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Seekers session for October. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'm glad that you could join us. And let's say hi to Jay. Jay, how are you?
Good to see you, Mark. Doing well. Thank you.
You too. Welcome. So, this month we're going to be looking at the shadow as confidant, guide, and muse, and why it is so critical on the Seeker's path not to shy away from darkness. Spirit contains both darkness and light. This is very important to know. Our power comes through our wholeness. Our wholeness comes from integration. Integration means allowing the totality of who we are into our awareness to the best of our ability and making space for all of it to be there. Darkness is intimately linked to creativity. Many of our deepest inspirations actually lie in the shadow or on the lower rungs of our awareness, somewhere in between darkness and light, where we can hardly see them. The things that inspire us, our gifts, are frequently mired in shame, desire, perfectionism, and longing. These parts are suppressed because they make us feel uncertain or vulnerable or different, like outsiders. But when we take the time to explore these suppressed parts honestly, through reflective writing or in some other contemplative practice, the shame coding begins to dissolve and the reality underneath is revealed. We touch into the power that's embedded in our darkness. Jay, could you please pull up the slides, please? You see this in the work of great artists. For example, the French painter and sculptor Louise Bourgeois is an excellent example of how shadow leads to genius. Bourgeois spent 70 years exploring what it means to retrieve the treasures in the dark and turn them into objects of beauty and communication. She was especially drawn to exploring her unconscious, her sexuality, her dreams, as well as her obsession with her mother. In fact, it was out of the grief of losing her mother that Louise Bourgeois gave up her study of mathematics and turned to art as a way of coping with and channeling her own emotional upheaval. So just look at these amazing images. Notice what they make you feel: the power, the discomfort, the fear, the longing, the mixture of life and death. They connect us to the artist at the most primitive universal level because this work came from her deepest core. So there is a time honored spiritual tradition of vision and healing coming out of the shadow. As the poet Theodore Roethke said, in a dark time, the eye begins to see. The mystics have sung of the God filled darkness since time immemorial. The 19th century Bengali mystic and mother worshipper Sri Ramakrishna said, "In dense darkness, O mother, thy formless beauty sparkles." Rumi talks about the night when he and I are lost in love, speaking of his divine beloved. Both of these wise men knew that the interplay of darkness and light is not simple because human beings aren't simple. Wisdom is subtle and many layered. It requires us to look at parts of ourselves we would often much rather prefer to keep in the darkness. The ancient Greeks called this act of confronting our dark side metanoia. Metanoia. That's the moment of awakening, of initiation, that shatters the ego's pretenses, its self righteousness, and the conceit of believing that others are somehow worse than we are. That's what collapses the feeling of us versus them and unifies us more deeply with others. But metanoia comes in many flavors, as we were talking about last month in our exploration of the giant within and how we come into awareness of our own spiritual identity. Our guest, Steve Taylor, talked about it in our interview, how some people face their own darkness and see through their own ego through blissful experience, while others awaken in suffering. For some, it happens quickly, spontaneously, when they're least expecting it, while for others, it's the fruit of practice. Sometimes wisdom comes to us through shock or ugliness. And we've talked about this before in the Seekers Forum, that whatever it takes to wake us up is grace. Sometimes our confidants, our guides, and muses show up in the most unexpected places, inviting us to look within. Andrew Harvey told me many years ago about an experience that I have never forgotten. It's not a teaching story for the faint of heart, but it does contain profound wisdom. He had been taken to a holy place in the north of India that they called the Rat Temple. Pilgrims used to come and worship and feed this massive horde of rats in an underground pit. Andrew described the shock of standing on a platform and peering into the darkness and seeing that it was swarming, and how he felt spiritually challenged in a way that he had never been before. And that's what gave him the revelation. He said, I realized that until I could bless this swarming darkness, I knew nothing. I couldn't say that I love God or that I love the creation. Until I could look at the part of human nature that was like a swarming night of rats, I would never understand how humanity created concentration camps, how humanity destroys the environment, the cruelty between people. Until he could find the holiness in the shadows, he could not begin to transform it. And that is an ancient spiritual teaching. Our blackest darkness and our brightest light are completely intermingled. Until we can detect the holiness in our dark parts, for no other reason that they make us human, we can't use them as engines of transformation. We can't accept that the part of us that is wild, that transcends conventional duality, and that encompasses the shadow. We are instead trained to fear our aboriginal self, our original nature, particularly its extremes. But that interferes with the getting of wisdom. Because in order to be wise, we need to protect this untamed spirit in ourselves. That doesn't mean acting out of wildness necessarily, but rather keeping its primal flame alive in us, like a pilot light, to keep our spiritual oven heated. That's the last thing we're taught to do in our society, as all of us know. It's antithetical to what we believe about what it means to be civilized and sociable. In most cultures, we're taught obedience before we're old enough to talk. We're taught to imitate others, to tamp down our dark parts, and to repeat what has been done before. Risk-taking, experimentation, trusting the voice within? No. Playing it safe? Maybe next year, staying on the straight and narrow? Yes. Now, the purpose of contemplative practices, of course, whether it's meditation or prayer or writing, is to stop playing it safe, to trespass the ego's self-protective boundaries, to transcend the image that we project outward and take a good hard look around what's inside, getting to know our hidden parts, allowing ourselves not to know. It's not for nothing that the greatest Christian classic of the Middle Ages was titled The Cloud of Unknowing. It's all about being courageous enough to enter the realm of not knowing in order to perceive the divine, in order to awaken to a different kind of knowledge. This is connected to the archetypal character of the blind sage that you see in literature and art, the one who wakes up to a new kind of vision. Remember, Saul had to pass through a period of blindness when Christ came to him before he could become Paul. And that is how darkness becomes our muse, by blinding us, spiritually speaking, and revealing hidden wisdom. Moving past our daylight sense of self, the one we show the world, the performer, the pleaser, the conformist, the loyal, obedient one, and making way for the wild darkness, which is often far more raw, honest, real, and compelling than the daylight self. A friend of mine learned this recently in an art class, of all places. He was studying painting, but his work was just going nowhere. It was safe and dull and kind of placid, kind of forgettable. So his teacher, out of the blue, suggested that he use more black. Well, it was as if he had found the magic key. Suddenly his paintings became vivid and disturbing and powerful. Allowing himself to paint with black released a part of him that he tends to hide under a genial exterior. Things like his rage, his violence, his fear, his aggression, his sexuality, his nonconformity. Suddenly black, painting with black, gave him permission to bring that into his artwork and to experience it himself and the power of it. Not only did his work improve, he also found it extremely therapeutic to reveal these shadow parts of himself. Through painting, he found a way to transmute his own dark energies into something that was bright and something that is alive. not only on the canvas, but also off. I had a parallel experience in my own work when many years ago I started to write about personal experiences. This is something I had never done before. When I finally allowed myself to reveal painful things on the page, it was as if the writer's dam just burst inside me. By allowing myself to describe what lay in my shadow, I found that there were suddenly 1,000 stories I wanted to tell, 1,000 lessons I felt like I had learned. Opening to pain connected me to my creative power. It taught me who I was as an artist. I realized that nothing truly interested me as a writer or as a human being but the human struggle. If there wasn't suffering, pathos, confusion, longing, aspiration, or some honest exploration of the hard things about what it means to be human, my muse just had no interest. She refused to get out of bed. Now, I'm not saying that we should go through our lives emphasizing the negative, focusing on suffering, playing the role of the walking wounded. Of course not. But we don't want to forget about the black paint either. We don't want to turn away from what's hidden and uncomfortable and unknown, because that is where much of our power lies. As seekers, we are, by definition, people who are drawn to life's depths, who want to understand the reality of things, to not be trapped on the surface of life, unable to access the treasures beneath. We know full well that our daylight self is only half of the picture, if that, and that without the shadow, we are incomplete. But the question is, how can we trust the shadow as a confidant, guide, and muse? Here are four reflections that I'd just like to invite you to work with in your spiritual practice, whether you're writing or in therapy, in prayer, or whatnot. The first one is this: what are you most afraid that other people will learn about you? What are you most afraid that other people will learn about you? This question is a gold mine for self understanding. You discover that this thing you're afraid to show is connected to all kinds of narratives about what it means, what it says about you, how others will view you, which relationships would be threatened, how your status would change, what coveted part of your own self image would have to be sacrificed. It will show you what you keep in the closet and why. You don't need to reveal this to anyone. That's not the point. But it's imperative to know it for yourself and to really get why it has its hold on you. Remember, we often hide things for other people. That's the story that we tell ourselves. We're doing it for other people. We keep things in the shadow out of kindness, out of consideration. We tell ourselves that guilt and fear and shame are simply the price that we pay for being good people. But is that true? Or is that just a self justifying story intended to keep us obedient? These are great questions to explore. The second reflection is, what breaks your heart? What breaks your heart? Which aspects of your life seem intolerable, unbearable, tragic, insurmountable? What slays you, tears you apart, feels too painful for you to confront? This is another deep reservoir of treasures because knowing what breaks your heart demonstrates what you truly care about, where your values actually lie, where you feel kinship, belonging, and love, what you're most afraid of losing, and what for you makes life not seem worth living. When you touch that warm, dark current within, you come to see that there's a place where beauty and sadness meet. And that, contrary to what you've been led to believe, touching the raw chords of the human condition actually enlivens and enlarges you. You feel alive in a new way, feeling the intensity of your emotions. Again, this isn't about getting lost in emotions or heartbreak, but about seeing clearly what truly moves you and why, because this can be a revelation. Once you know what breaks your heart, you can use this information to practice more care, to increase your compassion, and to bring more aliveness to your experience. The third reflection is, which desires are cloaked in shame? Which desires are cloaked in shame? I often talk about the energy of desire and what a mistake it is to suppress it with spirituality rather than to recognize its divine source. When you discover the vitality of desire as a force, a pulsation, an enlivener, you step into your incarnation. You build appreciation for the power of the imagination, which is truly a gift from God, because the imagination is what allows us to transform energy into different forms. You see that shame is like grime that clogs up your system, like a layer of coal dust that covers up the things that frighten you, hurt you, humiliate you. Desire is one of our most shameful treasures because it reveals our vulnerability. It shows us our humanness, our disappointment, our aspiration. And that's why so many people bury their desires with stories about being considerate to others, or not deserving, or not being selfish. When we acknowledge the power of desire as a force that's connected to our authenticity, we liberate our vitality and the inspiration that goes with it. And finally, the fourth reflection: how do you think and feel about death? A person's thoughts about mortality impact her quality of life more, perhaps, than any other single component of existence. Whether you're aware of it or not, death is at the center of your life plan. Whether you're someone who obsesses over impermanence or one who never consciously thinks about death and dying. The denial of death has far ranging effects, as we know from psychologist Ernest Becker. The Western phenomenon of death avoidance turns us into addicts, narcissists, and overconsumers. It affects our relationships, the ability to be intimate, our resilience, and other key factors of what it means to live a meaningful life. When you look directly at your thoughts and feelings about death, you'll likely notice patterns about how you live that may have escaped you. The more intimate you are with your own death story, the more precious and astonishing your life will become, because you enter the present more fully. You awaken spiritually to yourself and to others, as well as the astounding paradoxes of what it means to be alive. This is the greatest treasure of all in the end: joie de vivre, the joy of being. It's counterintuitive but true that this joy is directly linked to our mortality when we allow ourselves to feel it fully. So let's do some writing. Jay, would you please pull up the card? I'd like you now, please, to take 15 minutes to describe one aspect of your personal shadow that you find inspiring or ripe for exploration. One aspect of your personal shadow that inspires you or feels ripe, interesting for exploration. We'll take 15 minutes to do that, please, and then we'll come back together as a group.